Today, we're breaking down some of the worst wedding deaths ever recorded. From a skydiving ceremony that ended during a 14,000-foot descent to a quiet mountain shrine wedding where a bride's walk to the altar ended in a way no one present was prepared to witness. It was June 14th, 2015. At a private skydiving drop zone near Lodi, California, a wedding party gathered beside a dusty runway for vows in freefall. Surface winds were light, with a steady upper-level drift noted during the morning load brief as jumpers prepared their equipment. Among the group was Daniel Ruiz, 56. After 3 decades teaching civics at a local high school, retirement led him toward officiating unconventional weddings, ceremonies built around controlled risk. He had logged 287 solo jumps over the years, experienced for a recreational skydiver but not rated as an instructor. Most of his experience came from standard formation jumps and solo descents in clear conditions. That day, he agreed to lead vows in freefall, framing the event as symbolic but controlled. The couple was newly licensed skydivers cleared for independent jumps. Their plan was simple: exit together, hold a brief formation, then separate and deploy at 5,000 feet in line with drop zone policy. Staff approved it with firm limits: no low pulls, no canopy proximity after opening, and nothing that could interfere with emergency handles. Daniel wore a standard sport rig and secured a laminated vow card flat against his chest strap. The gear check showed no loose or misrouted equipment. At 14,000 feet, the door opened over dry farmland with winds still within operating limits. The group exited in sequence, stabilized quickly, linked hands for several seconds, then separated cleanly at the planned altitude. At deployment height, the couple waved off and pulled, their rectangular canopies inflating symmetrically before settling into steady forward flight. Observers below saw 2 predictable descent patterns drifting toward the landing area as Daniel deployed seconds later. His pilot chute launched cleanly, extracting the main canopy from the container. The fabric began to spread, but then snapped sharply to one side when part of the canopy folded over a suspension line. The parachute entered a tightening rotation, forming a visible corkscrew pattern that accelerated with each revolution. Witnesses reported the descent rate increasing as the spin failed to correct itself. From the ground, the malfunction intensified the spin, increasing both rotation and descent speed. Daniel appeared to reach upward toward the risers, attempting to counter the movement as the canopy continued tightening into a corkscrew pattern. Altitude dropped rapidly through 3,000 feet. The rotation showed no signs of slowing as he descended past 2,000. At approximately 1,300 feet, he initiated emergency procedures. The main canopy released as he pulled the cutaway handle. The reserve deployed immediately and inflated, but the remaining altitude was minimal. The spin stopped, yet there was not enough vertical distance to slow to a survivable landing speed. Witnesses saw the reserve overhead for only seconds before impact. He struck the dirt landing area at high vertical speed and did not move. Staff reached him within moments and began emergency procedures. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner documented multiple skull fractures, a high cervical spine injury, rib fractures, and severe internal trauma consistent with a high-speed vertical impact. Equipment inspection confirmed a line-over malfunction in the main canopy, while the reserve deployed correctly but too low to achieve full deceleration. Toxicology results were negative, and the death was ruled accidental, with delayed emergency action identified as the primary contributing factor. In the months that followed, the drop zone banned handheld props during staged ceremony jumps and introduced stricter deployment altitude minimums with closer instructor oversight. Investigators concluded that the malfunction itself was survivable, but the reduced altitude left no margin for recovery, and the case was formally closed as an accidental death during a staged wedding skydive. The first story unfolded in open sky, where altitude left little room for hesitation. But back on the ground, another ceremony relied on teamwork and tradition, and a single hidden detail inside a piece of old timber would change everything. It was September 9th, 2016. In a forest clearing outside Freiburg in Germany's Black Forest, guests gathered beside a timber-framed barn for a traditional wedding ritual. Long wooden tables sat under string lights, and a reclaimed log rested across 2 sawhorses at the center of the clearing. At the center of the ceremony was Thomas Bauer, 28. He worked as a mechanical technician at a regional manufacturing plant, calibrating industrial cutters and maintaining safety guards on automated equipment. Co-workers described him as methodical and calm. Outside of work, he restored antique hand tools in a small workshop behind his home and occasionally hosted informal woodworking sessions for neighbors. Family members later said he often reminded people that reclaimed timber should be checked carefully before cutting because old wood can conceal hidden metal. The ritual, known as Baumstammsägen, symbolized cooperation in marriage. The couple would use a long two-person crosscut saw to cut through a log together, demonstrating teamwork in front of family and friends. The beam selected that afternoon was salvaged barn timber, dense, weathered, and decades old. Its outer surface showed age cracks and darkened grain, but no visible hardware. Witnesses later stated that Thomas briefly mentioned checking the beam for embedded nails during setup. There was no formal inspection, and no metal detector was used. The ceremony was running slightly behind schedule, and attention shifted toward keeping the guests engaged. To create a shallow starter notch and make the first pass easier for photographs, Thomas's father volunteered to use a gasoline chainsaw. The saw was a mid-range 50 cubic centimeter consumer model with a 16-inch guide bar, commonly used for firewood. It had been used earlier that week without issue. Thomas stood a few feet away, positioned to step in once the notch was complete. Several guests drifted closer to watch. His father shifted his footing slightly to the side of the beam, bent at the waist, and lowered the spinning chain into the upper surface. The cut began normally, sending a steady spray of pale wood chips outward. Approximately 2 inches into the timber, witnesses heard a sharp, metallic spark and a sudden change in pitch as the chain struck hidden metal inside the beam. The saw jerked violently upward in a split second, snapping back toward Thomas before anyone nearby could react. The guide bar snapped upward and backward. The father's grip broke as the rotating chain redirected toward Thomas. The moving chain crossed the short distance between them and struck him across the left collarbone and lower neck. Thomas fell immediately. The chainsaw was pulled away. Several people rushed forward and applied direct pressure to the wound. Blood loss was immediate and heavy. Thomas attempted to raise his right hand toward his shoulder before losing responsiveness. Emergency services were called from the clearing. First responders arrived in approximately 10 to 12 minutes. On assessment, he had no pulse and was not breathing. The volume of blood loss was already critical. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy documented a deep incised wound across the left supraclavicular region. The subclavian artery had been completely severed. Blood filled the left chest cavity, consistent with rapid exsanguination. No additional traumatic injuries were identified. Toxicology was negative. The chainsaw was examined and found mechanically functional, with no defects in the chain brake or guide assembly. Investigators later cut fully through the beam. Embedded deep within the timber was an old iron fence spike, concealed beneath layers of aged wood and oxidation. Its position matched the depth of the initial cut. Damage to the chain and witness accounts were consistent with sudden metal contact at the guide bar tip, producing the upward kickback that redirected the saw. Thomas had spent years reminding others to inspect reclaimed materials before using power tools. The salvage beam was removed from the site and retained as evidence. In the months that followed, his family converted his workshop into a small community space dedicated to tool safety awareness, preserving his restored benches and labeled instruments exactly as he had left them. That ritual centered on tools and preparation. The next ceremony looked quieter, set beside the ocean, shaped by symbolism rather than machinery. Yet the environment itself would become part of the outcome. It was August the 20th, 2014. In Puerto Vallarta, the late afternoon tide edged closer to a small wooden gazebo set about 36 inches above packed sand. Wind pushed in from the southwest, raising steady whitecaps offshore. Guests noticed the water creeping nearer, but the ceremony continued. At the center of the ceremony stood Camilla Torres, 27, the bride, beside her fiancé, Jay Paulson, 31. A graduate student in coastal hydrodynamics at a university in Mexico City, she had spent years studying how waves interact with shorelines, often choosing coastal settings for research trips and family gatherings. Together, they chose a seaside ceremony that reflected that part of her life, incorporating the traditional silver lazo ritual, a figure-8 rope placed around the couple to symbolize unity during their vows. Friends described her as methodical and calm, someone who trusted preparation and structure even in unpredictable environments. The gazebo had been placed near the upper wet sand margin rather than on fully dry beach. Earlier waves had already reached the lowest step, leaving darker patches along the wood. The wedding planner had reviewed the forecast that morning, and while no storm warnings were issued, marine reports noted a building swell consistent with late summer winds. As part of the ceremony, a traditional silver lazo was draped around Camilla and Jay in a figure-8 pattern, resting across their shoulders as they faced the ocean for photographs. Wind gusts reached around 20 miles per hour, and guests later said intermittent spray had touched the lower boards during earlier wave sets. Camilla briefly glanced toward the advancing foam line before refocusing on the vows. Midway through the ceremony, the photographer asked the couple to step slightly closer to the edge for a clearer shot. Witnesses later described the next incoming wave as larger than the previous ones, though not visually alarming from a distance. It rose within the normal rhythm of the tide, then pushed forward with greater reach. The wave rolled past the wet sand boundary and struck the wooden steps and front supports of the gazebo. Water surged across the deck in a single forceful sheet, and the platform shuddered under the sudden impact. Jay, weighing just over 200 pounds, lost traction as the water covered the boards. He stumbled backward and fell off the side of the gazebo. Because the lazo bound them together, he dropped below deck level while still looped to Camilla's shoulders, transferring his full weight into the rope as he fell. The line snapped tight and slid upward toward her neck. Witnesses saw Camilla pulled sharply toward a support post as the lazo tightened under the sudden weight, her hands rising immediately toward her throat. Jay hit the sand below, but the drop had already created maximum tension in the rope, compressing her airway and the major blood vessels in her neck at the same time. Guests rushed forward. Jay attempted to stand and relieve pressure, but the rope remained taut for several critical seconds, while multiple people worked to loosen the lazo manually. By the time it was pulled free, Camilla had collapsed onto the deck. She was carried onto the sand as emergency responders arrived minutes later, but resuscitation efforts at the scene were unsuccessful. The medical examination documented a fractured hyoid bone, bruising of the larynx, and extensive soft tissue swelling that narrowed the airway. Petechial hemorrhages were present in the eyes and facial skin, with no evidence of drowning. The cause of death was determined to be ligature strangulation resulting from sudden mechanical constriction during the fall. Investigators documented rope tension marks on the vertical support and indentation patterns consistent with witness statements. Reconstruction showed Jay's fall created sufficient downward force to turn the ceremonial rope into a tightening ligature within seconds, and the death was ruled accidental. In the months that followed, the gazebo was relocated farther inland, and organizers began placing stricter limits on elevated shoreline ceremonies during changing tide conditions. Water and movement played a role in that moment, but the next wedding took place far from the shoreline, along a narrow path where wind and terrain mattered more than anyone expected. We've got more wedding tragedies ahead. Consider subscribing if you want to see how carefully planned ceremonies can turn fatal in seconds. It was October 12th, 2018. At Takachiho Shrine in Miyazaki Prefecture, steady afternoon wind moved through cedar trees above a narrow gravel path carved along a steep ravine. Guests adjusted sleeves and hair as small stones shifted underfoot near an exposed edge, typical of the shrine's historic, minimally protected grounds. Among them was Aiko Tanabe, 24, the bride. She had recently graduated with a degree in architecture focused on traditional wooden structures and planned to work in heritage preservation, restoring aging temples without altering their original form. Choosing a shrine ceremony had been her idea, drawn to spaces where history and structure remained visible in everyday use. Friends said she often noticed small details others missed, straightening uneven displays, adjusting frames, and quietly pointing out structural flaws during visits to historic sites. She treated balance and structure as habits formed long before her career began. That afternoon, she wore a formal white kimono and a sunoka kushi, a broad, rigid bridal headpiece secured into a styled wig with combs and ties. It did not weigh much, but it extended outward from her shoulders, catching more of the wind moving through the gorge. Weather data later reviewed from the nearby Takachiho station recorded sustained winds around 20 miles per hour, with gusts reaching between 40 and 45 as air funneled through the gorge corridor. Like many traditional shrines, the path followed the natural terrain, with gravel layered over compacted soil along a curve that sloped toward a 65 to 75-foot drop onto rock shelves and shallow water below. There were no tall guardrails, only low wooden posts spaced intermittently. Earlier in the afternoon, a shrine attendant mentioned strong crosswinds along the cliffside stretch and suggested keeping photographs closer to the main courtyard. The photographer preferred the gorge backdrop. By then, repeated foot traffic had loosened the top layer of gravel. Aiko stepped onto the narrow curve with two bridesmaids several feet behind her, their sandals crunching lightly against the gravel. Other guests stayed back to leave the photographer a clear line of sight. The wind moved left to right across the path in uneven bursts, lifting her wide sleeves and pressing the fabric briefly against her arms before easing again. Small pebbles shifted and skittered toward the exposed edge with each gust. She paused near the outer side of the curve to steady herself, adjusting her stance by inches. Witnesses later said she glanced down briefly at her footing. As another gust pushed through the trees, the headpiece and sleeves caught the air together. This gust was stronger. It did not lift her, but it twisted her upper body to the right. Her right heel rolled on loose gravel. The sole slid outward across the shifting surface. She raised her arms to counterbalance, but the lateral force continued for another fraction of a second. Several witnesses described hearing a short scraping sound as her sandal lost contact. Her body pivoted toward the drop. Gravel scattered beneath her feet. She tipped sideways and disappeared over the edge in less than a second. Two guests lunged forward but stopped short of the exposed rim. Below, observers saw her strike a rock outcrop approximately 25 to 35 feet down before continuing to tumble. Her head made forceful contact with a jagged stone near the base of the ravine. She came to rest against uneven rock near shallow water. Shrine personnel and bystanders moved along a maintenance access route toward the gorge floor. Rope support was required to reach her safely. When responders reached her position, she showed no pulse and no spontaneous respirations. The autopsy documented multiple skull fractures and a high cervical spine dislocation, a break at the upper neck where it connects to the skull. Severe lung contusions and internal bleeding were also present, consistent with high-impact blunt force trauma. The medical examiner concluded that the head and upper cervical injuries would have caused immediate loss of consciousness and were rapidly fatal. Toxicology results were negative. The death was ruled accidental. In the months that followed, shrine officials installed low-profile safety barriers along the exposed curve. The additions preserved the traditional appearance while creating a clearer boundary along the ravine's edge. The previous story showed how a single step can shift everything. The final case didn't involve height or tools, only a crowded corridor, a familiar tradition, and pressure building in ways that weren't visible until it was too late. It was February 3, 2017. Inside a marble corridor at a heritage wedding venue in Udaipur, Rajasthan, guests press shoulder to shoulder for a ritual that usually ends in laughter. The centuries-old palace passages were built for small processions, not modern guest lists. The polished marble floor reflected the afternoon light, already crowded to near capacity. Near the altar stood Ria Malhotra, 15, a younger cousin on the bride's side. A 10th grade student who excelled in debate, she was calm in front of crowds and used to the noise and energy of large family gatherings. Smaller than many of the adults around her, she moved easily through busy celebrations where weddings felt familiar, predictable, and loud. The corridor measured roughly 8 feet wide, bordered on one side by carved stone railings overlooking a lower courtyard. On the other side stood thick sandstone walls. The marble floor had been polished repeatedly over the years, and under leather sandals and formal shoes, it offered limited traction. There were no temporary barriers, ushers, or designated crowd controls in place. The space relied entirely on guests moderating themselves. When the Juda Chupai ritual began, the groom removed his shoes at the entrance as custom required. Male cousins quickly surrounded them in mock defense as the bride's relatives surged forward to steal them, laughing and shouting negotiated demands. Witnesses later estimated that around 40 people entered the corridor within seconds. Some had been standing outside and rushed in once they heard cheering. Movement tightened almost immediately. Those near the center had little visibility of the floor and could not see if someone ahead had stumbled. The noise level increased, echoing off stone walls and amplifying confusion. Ria stood near the stone railing just behind the bride, close enough to watch, but not actively participating. She turned slightly to make space as more relatives pressed inward. A sudden push from behind forced her forward. Her shoes slipped against the polished marble and she lost her balance, falling backward into the carved balustrade. The stone edge struck across her lower back. Before she could steady herself, two people stumbled into her legs. She tried to rise, but the pressure from behind intensified. The surge was not a running stampede. It was a dense, slow compression. Guests were pressed chest to back with almost no ability to step sideways or retreat. Those farther back continued pushing, unaware that the front rows had stopped moving. Ria became pinned upright against the railing. Her back was braced against stone. Her torso was trapped by the combined weight of bodies in front of her. Her arms were restricted at her sides, unable to lift high enough to signal distress. Witnesses later said that from a distance, she appeared crouched or bent as part of the game. The ritual's shouting masked any call for help. Visibility was limited to the backs of other guests' heads and shoulders. As compression continued, her chest movement became visibly restricted. Witnesses nearby later said she appeared unable to take full breaths while the crowd pressed forward, unaware that those at the front could no longer move. Those immediately around her did not realize she was already in distress. It took several seconds after the forward momentum eased for anyone to notice she was unresponsive. When the crowd finally shifted and bodies redistributed, her weight was no longer supported. She slid down along the railing to the floor. Laughter stopped abruptly. Emergency personnel arrived within standard urban response time. She had no pulse and was not breathing. Resuscitation efforts were attempted at the scene but were unsuccessful. The post-mortem examination documented bruising across her chest and shoulders and non-displaced rib fractures consistent with sustained external compression. There was no major internal bleeding. Petechial hemorrhages, small red spots in the eyes and facial skin, indicated oxygen deprivation. The official cause of death was compressive asphyxia due to crowd collapse. Investigators concluded that overcrowding inside the confined marble corridor created fatal compressive forces, with no evidence of intentional harm or structural failure. The death was officially ruled accidental. In the months that followed, the venue introduced guest flow limits and assigned attendants to monitor crowd density during high-energy rituals. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.